The boots came first, slow, heavy, echoing through a shattered stone corridor as dawn pressed its pale fingers against the ruins of Nuremberg. Somewhere beyond the walls, a crow cried, sharp, lonely, final. Inside a cold holding room, 12 young women sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing the kind of silence that only exists before death. Their hands trembled. Their eyes were hollow. Not one of them spoke, because in minutes, rifles were supposed to speak for them. But history was about to hesitate, and in that hesitation, 12 lives would slip through the fingers of war. April 1945. Germany was no longer a nation. It was a wound. Nuremberg, once the ceremonial soul of the Third Reich, now lay crushed beneath Allied artillery and moral collapse. Buildings leaned like exhausted giants. Smoke clung to the air, thick with the smell of burned paper, fuel, and regret. The war was technically ending, but its final breaths were violent, confused, and unforgiving. In makeshift detention camps carved from bombed schools and factories, prisoners waited not for justice, but for decisions made too quickly to feel human. Inside one such camp, 12 German girls were being processed for execution. They were not officers, not interrogators, not guards. They were clerks, switchboard operators, typists, teenagers, most barely past 18, but they had worn SS insignia, and in 1945, that was enough to die. The order had already been written: execution at dawn. No trial, no delay. The women knew what awaited them. All night, they whispered names of mothers who would never know what happened. One clutched a photograph folded so many times it had softened like cloth. Another quietly rehearsed a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. Outside their cell, American soldiers stood guard. Men of the 45th Infantry Division, veterans of Sicily, survivors of Anzio, witnesses to Dachau. Just days earlier, they had walked through that camp's gates and seen what human cruelty truly looked like. Emaciated bodies, empty eyes, the smell that never left your clothes. They had every reason to hate, and yet something felt wrong. Sergeant Daniel Crow wasn't a man prone to doubt. He'd been forged by combat, shaped by loss, trained to follow orders even when they scraped against his conscience. But that night, standing outside the holding room, something gnawed at him. These weren't fanatics screaming slogans. They weren't defiant. They were terrified. Crow thought of his younger sister back in Ohio. He thought of the way fear shrinks a person inward. And suddenly, the war stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a choice. He reread the execution order twice, then folded it and made a decision that could have ended his career or his life. What few records later revealed is that no formal tribunal had reviewed the women's cases. The collapse of Nazi bureaucracy had left thousands misclassified. Some SS auxiliaries were conscripts. Others were reassigned teenagers pulled from civil service roles. One rarely mentioned detail: Allied intelligence units were overwhelmed. Paperwork lagged days behind reality. Names were misspelled. Files were incomplete. In that chaos, justice became a guessing game. Crow understood that once rifles were raised, truth would be irrelevant. At dawn, the cell door cracked open. The women flinched, but no rifles entered. Instead, they smelled coffee, bread, eggs, warmth. American soldiers stepped inside carrying trays. No one spoke. One girl began to cry, not from fear, but confusion. Another whispered, "Is this a trick?" It wasn't. For a few minutes, the war disappeared. They ate together, enemy and captor, human and human. That moment, fragile, unrepeatable, cracked something open in the men of the 45th. They weren't just delaying death. They were choosing life. Crow knew breakfast wasn't enough. So he moved. Documents were altered, classifications rewritten, The women were reassigned as displaced civilians. Transport manifests were quietly edited. A truck heading west was suddenly carrying 12 more souls than scheduled. Every signature risked prison. Every stamp could expose the lie. But no one hesitated. This was not rebellion fueled by anger. It was defiance rooted in conscience. As the truck idled, one of the women stepped forward, holding a violin she had somehow kept through everything. She played, not a melody of sorrow, but of release. A sound that floated briefly above the ruins of Europe before disappearing into the wind. No one spoke. No one forgot. The women vanished into the displaced masses of post-war Europe. Records dissolved. Names were lost. Survival became anonymity. The soldiers returned home and said nothing, because mercy in 1945 was not something you bragged about. For decades, the story stayed buried. No medals, no commendations, just quiet lives shaped by a single moral stand. It wasn't until the late 1990s that fragments emerged. Journal entries, interviews, whispered recollections from aging veterans who finally felt safe enough to speak. They didn't call it heroism, they called it necessity. They didn't just save 12 women, they saved themselves. After witnessing the abyss of human cruelty, they refused to let it define them. They proved that even at the end of the world, choice still exists. That mercy can be an act of rebellion. That humanity can survive even where hope seems impossible. History often tells us who won and who lost, but it rarely tells us who chose compassion when hatred would have been easier. In the ruins of Nuremberg, no medals were given, no headlines written, just a quiet defiance against the machinery of death. 12 lives spared. A line not crossed. A moment that whispered through time instead of shouting. And maybe that's where true courage lives. Not in the roar of battle, but in the quiet refusal to surrender one's humanity. Because when the world is burning, sometimes the bravest act is simply choosing not to add another flame.